So thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I'm very excited to share my research with you. So as ma'am mentioned, my lecture today is entitled Blurred Encounters, Vulnerability, and Counter Visibility in the Digital Protest Materials of Filipina Undocumented Migrant Workers in London. So this is part of my MA thesis, which broadly explores different manifestations of resistance online by migrant collectives during the pandemic. So I will begin. In 2020, the Secretary of the Philippines Department of Labor and Employment announced an offer for the United Kingdom and Germany. The Philippines will deploy more Filipino healthcare workers to their countries in exchange for 600,000 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. This statement was made with the promise that these two countries will be exempted from the existing deployment ban imposed by the Philippine government when the pandemic began. This bartering of laboring bodies for vaccines demonstrates the hegemonic view of the laborer as a material resource that the state can produce and manipulate for profit, historically established in the Philippines through export-oriented education and labor policies. For undocumented Filipina migrant workers in the UK, this condition takes on more dire manifestations. The UK, along with other nations in the global north, has been benefiting from the unregulated, underpaid, and thereby flexible work of undocumented migrants that accept these labor conditions given their non-status or irregularity. Despite this, it has imposed a hostile environment for migrants, where one's immigration status needs to be checked before gaining access to livelihood, healthcare, housing, and other social services. So this study is interested in ways that undocumented migrant laborers articulate political and effective agency and resistance in the face of debilitating conditions brought by repressive state structures, both at home and abroad, during a global pandemic. I chose this topic through the confluence of my personal and academic interest in investigating the language and signification behind visual or textual acts of protest, as informed by feminist and critical discourse scholarship, during a time where these are heavily surveilled and suppressed. For this study, the pandemic is both material and perspective for discursive inquiry. And so I ask, how do digital protest materials frame undocumented migrant workers' vulnerability and visibility during the pandemic? I foreground how the migrant collective navigates the representation of undocumented workers and how these strategies disturb and reinterpret vulnerability and visibility in the virtual realm simultaneously permanent and fluid space. I argue that the language and imagery in Gabriela London's social media posts concerning the plight of undocumented Filipino workers manifest a counter visibility, one that asserts their presence and needs while allowing them to stay unrecognized by the UK's surveillance state. Social media has been a space where these encounters with violence have been recorded, disseminated, and made to flow with other pieces of content, imbuing our appreciation of these materials during a time of physical restrictions with unique political and discursive significance. So the study has gathered posts concerning undocumented workers from the Facebook page of Gabriela London, produced in 2020 when the lockdown started. This group was chosen for their publicly visible work in connecting with undocumented migrants as part of the Kanlungan Filipino Consortium and the Filipino Domestic Workers Association in the United Kingdom. They were also chosen for their relatively recent activity in social media at that point. Their Facebook page started in 2018 and became most active during the period of the research, 2020 to 2021, due to the pandemic and the escalating violence and discrimination this entailed toward Filipino migrant workers in the UK. My gathering of and engagement with the social media posts from these groups are shaped by digital ethnography and its focus on emerging digital technologies, new logics and practice of analysis, and perhaps more importantly, new forms of data, according to Hjorth, that redefine previously held ideas about theory and collaboration in research. I also drew from my prior experience with using critical discourse analysis as it is concerned with unraveling and analyzing the interrelationships of gender, power, and ideology in discourse, which includes text, talk, and multimodal multimodal dimensions such as visual images, layouts, gestures, and sounds. So for the purposes of this study, the CDA levels of analysis are discourse as text, in this case, the social media posts, discourse as discursive practice. In the analysis later, I will be going through how Gabriela London produced these posts, how they are disseminated in social media, and how undocumented people use and perceive the social media posts. And lastly, discourse as social practice, where I talk about how these posts interact with prevalent rhetoric around hostile environment in the UK and the counter visibility interruptions that undocumented workers put forth. My study is not singularly confined within the digital realm, though such definitions are essential in describing the nature or discursive tendencies of the materials being studied. Rather, it is concerned with interrogating the supposed binary between the digital space and the real world. By analyzing how those that have a great stake or are made vulnerable by ongoing capitalist crises make real the digital and make digital the real in the ways they manifest resistance and connections with one another. This effort is driven by how the inherent visibility of the social media posts can tend toward an easy extraction of imagery to be researched and analyzed that, in my view, can dominate the discussion over strands of experience that cannot be so easily seen or captured. Digital ethnography also foregrounds the role that technology has increasingly played in the lives of migrants over the years. This study contributes to the growing field of digital migration studies in its exploration of online platforms and digital tactics, as according to Lurs and Smets, transnational springboards for new and more public forms of diaspora identity politics. Because of this, my approach to digital ethnography developed from a focus on data to one that traces and amplifies narratives behind what we see on the screen. How the groups feel and process through their creation of social media art and content as they contend with overwhelming state violence. There are two main ways in which this is reflected in my discussion. First is through seeking and working on interactions with the community involved beyond their social media posts. I was able to interview one of the organizers and social media managers of Gabriela London, and I was also able to sit down with members of Gabriela during a mass and catch-up session when the restrictions eased in 2021. And second, through integrating these histories and narratives regarding migrant work in the critical discursive discussion of the social media posts. With this approach, I hope to contribute a nuanced study that exhibits a similar weaving of experiences, vulnerabilities, and modes of resistance that Filipino migrant workers themselves manifest day to day. The analysis for this study begins with a tracing of how undocumented workers have been viewed as a particularly vulnerable group. So the Latin root of the word vulnerability, vulnus meaning wound, provides a grounding for how this term has been deployed. Vulnerability expresses our capacity to be wounded or to suffer, according to Koivunen. However, despite this direct reference to the endurability of the body, vulnerability is not solely equivalent to the point of suffering or pain or harm, but rather it is the condition that makes all of these possible. Therefore, vulnerability is not a mere point in one's life, but rather a universal condition of our lives as embodied beings. Vulnerability necessarily engages with the organization and protection of bodily needs in response to unequal exposures to injury and foregrounds the fragile necessary dimensions of our interdependency, according to Puar. Our relationships to others, then, is ultimately the basis of our vulnerability, and I read this to be an assertion that it frames our existence not only through our being individual bodily subjects, but also through the tenuous connections that we make. Judith Butler's theorizations of vulnerability argue that people have a differential relation to life, and our being vulnerable should be understood through differentiated and differentiating historical conditions. From the perspective of feminist, queer, and anti-racist thinking, the binary between those that can protect themselves and those that cannot has become a normative identification, with the autonomous or invulnerable individual subject being implicitly male, white, Eurocentric, cisgendered, and able-bodied, allowing for vulnerable groups to almost automatically signify those diverging from it, according to Koivunen. This leads to problematic ways of addressing vulnerability, as it first cements the negative effects of vulnerability to be its defining trait. And second, affirms gendered, classed, and racialized assumptions that portray women or other social marginalized groups as not having the capacity for agency at all. The use of vulnerability to push for more access to basic rights, for instance, has been critiqued for its paternalistic and oppressive view of vulnerability, which ultimately presents a premise for more colonial, patriarchal, and heteronormative social control. How then can we begin to truly recognize vulnerability? And what would it mean to claim vulnerability from the position of the marginalized? So, recognizing vulnerability across individuals and institutions has the power to change meaning and the structure of vulnerability itself, according to Butler. This means that how we encounter vulnerability is defined by existing norms of recognition or conditions of eligibility, whether it be our own or coming from the institutions around us. This approach, I argue, shows that it is as much discursive as it is material. For Butler, we are rendered vulnerable through the norms that create the conditions of what counts as a livable life. Norms define our sociality and are the conditions under which we emerge as ourselves. We see here that vulnerability is woven into the process of our creation as subjects under capitalist and patriarchal systems. Overall, understandings of vulnerability show a transition from a focus on the body to the various aspects of embodiment, as they are informed by our relational and discursive approach to our lives in specific context. This study, then, is situated in the digital realm, in its challenging of the bounds of material and the virtual as a particular context in which vulnerability is approached. Examining this space entails a focus on the surrounding material, political, and discursive vulnerabilities that bring people into the space. This decentering and broadening of the digital highlight how the visual face of migrant labor groups online is both a starting point and the space itself for the political and effective work that goes into organizing during times of crisis. And so we now move into one of the most common responses to vulnerability, especially in the Philippine context, this idea of resilience. It is the answer to insurmountable and unending struggles. What doesn't kill you, as vulnerability is often proximal to death, makes you stronger, more resilient. This concept has been heavily deployed in Philippine mainstream discourses whenever a tragedy hits our shores. Resilience is constructed to be the counterpoint of vulnerability, according to Feynman. And the resilient Filipino image neatly coincides with the Bagong Bayani narrative that has helped ease the pains of separation, hard labor, and abuse experienced by migrant laborers abroad. Filipinos are known to not only persevere, but also to do it with a smile on their face. I read this transformation of pain into an exhibition of pride, and perhaps even more a kind of pleasure in withstanding such trauma as an operation of deferral. We suffer now to reap rewards later. However, instead of financial or material investments, the currency in this narrative is their intangible face. The moral and emotional fortitude to take the bad for the promise of something good later. According to Brock, the formation of a resilient self occurs in and through a particular temporality. Resilience involves an apprehension of the future, but a future projected both as disaster and recovery from disaster. This perpetualness of disaster, despite its being a manifestation of capitalist crisis, becomes the source of goodness, another way in which Filipino laborers are made to be good subjects. Resilience is viewed here not only as a logical response to the naturalized tragedies of capitalism, but also as the very material of marginalized people's agency, one that accepts the blows of the present for a future of goodness. And so I ask, is it possible for agency and resistance to emanate from vulnerability without precluding us from imagining an otherwise, nor affirming that we are solely victims of power imbalance? I am thinking here of an approach that goes beyond the rhetoric of diminishing vulnerability in favor of understanding its place in our efforts to dismantle oppressive systems. Indeed, there is no doubt that the work of affirming the liberatory or radical potential of vulnerability in the same way that we recognize its proximity to harm and death is itself a tenuous process. Butler recognizes that the relationship between vulnerability and resistance to be an exposure to power. When we decide or gather to resist, we risk being subjected to even more violence. On one level, this violence is caused by the visibility that arises when one reckons with their vulnerability collectively and publicly. This can be seen in how people who have publicly shared their stories of injustice and voiced their discontent alongside workers and victims of extrajudicial killings in the Philippines have been red tagged or were sent death threats, while others have been charged with an offense under the anti-terror law. These demonstrations of power are overt and chilling. They react to the visibility of dissent, the discourse of dissent, and serve to prevent the public from affirming the need for change. According to Butler, part of the work of resistance is acknowledging that any political act, whether it be planned or spontaneous, implicitly depends on an infrastructural condition that quite literally supports the acting body. This dialectical relationship between vulnerability and resistance may be read as limiting to the radical potential of vulnerability, but it is this embeddedness that positions the vulnerable, the non-normative body as the site of counter-globalization and resistance, according to Puar and Shildrick. This view is productive for how it reinvigorates vulnerable communities and recognizes how vulnerability itself informs resistance. Resistance does not aim to simply diminish or eradicate vulnerability. Rather, it engages it in envisioning an otherwise. Marginalized communities know suffering intimately and have a more grounded sense of how power moves through people and movements. Indeed, those that have been undone by suffering can be the agents of political transformation. And in this study, we see this demonstrated by OFWs continuing to work under exploitative labor contracts in the UK, while also mobilizing their fellows into political and protest actions. So the images that I have analyzed in this study are of undocumented workers. And the hostile sentiment toward migrants in European countries has been centered around the imagined threat of ruin and invasion. The discursive prevalence of migrant workers taking all available employment has become so potent in arousing anger and entitlement from both upper and working class people in the UK, regardless of their status. In reality, undocumented migrant laborers bear the brunt of oppressive labor and migrant policies as they perform crucial tasks. And this is the overall message that drives the materials published by Gabriela concerning the social-political status of undocumented migrant workers in London. Critical research on undocumented migrants considers the state of being undocumented or illegality to be a racial construct of nation states, border policing, and immigration law, according to Cronman and Johnson. This compounds a vulnerability that Filipino migrant women experience in the work they typically do, which is nursing and domestic work. The labor involved in these occupations entail close physical proximity and, to some extent, affective engagement, points of contact that imbue their work with unique significance and risk. These occupations sustain the health and lives of people that enable those people to do other kinds of work, all subsumed within sustaining the capitalist processes of the global north. And so, I argue that in response to these conditions of marginality and oppression, that undocumented workers respond to this marginal position through a counter visibility, as seen or as I will discuss in the protest materials that you see on your screen. So the images we find here approach the undocumented experience with straightforward urgency, driven by the pressures of organizing both material support and solidarity during the pandemic. An organizer from Gabriela London, Niel Camilon, narrated his experience of organizing within the collective, stating that he was privileged to be working as a retail designer and that he takes it upon himself to craft social media posts and statements in his free time because he knows that others have less time. He recognized how social media and the relentless cycles of violence and grief that they have been facing during the pandemic require an immediate response that would reinforce calls for swift state intervention on injustices. The immediacy is also important to reassure the migrant community of their unwavering presence amidst tragedy. These posts then place a text front and center as they are meant to impart information about protest actions and help toward undocumented migrants. Their audience are fellow workers in London who are engaging in informal work or are undocumented, and who might need help escaping abusive employers or in navigating the legal system to appeal their status. Niel remarked how the discursive direction for the posts is important in reaching as many people as they can due to the technological divide that he observed in their community. The women shown in these images thus occupy a treacherous and liminal space. They perform essential tasks, fulfilling roles that society cannot function without, yet they are ultimately deemed disposable and incongruent to the myths of progress that the global north operates under. Image 1 on your left was published on May 1, 2020, a photograph of the Gabriela representative and the undocumented workers with text that urges the reader to makilahok at tumulong, ayuda sa ating mga kababayang undocumented sa United Kingdom. Image 2 on your right, published in May 14, 2020, adds to this message by reiterating the protest call, Ayuda, Hindi Diktadurya, where the former is an address to the general reader, the latter is directed toward the Duterte government's militaristic approach to the pandemic. They depict the undocumented women in the images as they are, posing readily for a selfie during a time of restrictions on in-person meetings imposed by the UK government. Their presence, framed by the text, positions them as the face and voice of the protest calls. The language of the posts declare and impress upon the audience the need for the state's immediate response to the conditions that undocumented workers face, while also affirming the group's presence in filling these gaps. One of the notable choices in this imagery is the blurring of the face of the undocumented women, signaling to the audience the uncertainty and complexities of giving and receiving aid for people whose public recognition might compromise their status. As viewers of the image, we are permitted to see inside her home, to know that she has made contact with Gabriela, and that she has persisted through being undocumented in London, all without knowing her face nor her name. This concept of visibility has been deployed by scholars and activists in trying to account for the varied and often contested ways that marginalized groups manifest or negotiate their presence in public. The political and socioeconomic vulnerability experienced by Filipina migrant domestic workers may be read in this instance as a kind of liminal visibility, one that is simultaneously contingent on the deliberate disappearance or naturalization of the social reproductive work they do and their marked racialized presence as migrants. When faced with abusive employers, domestic workers in the UK that have a valid working visa risk becoming illegal. The Hostile Environment Scheme, which took effect in 2012, removed the rights of domestic workers to change their employers. This has been amended in 2020 to allow domestic workers to legally change their employers in the UK within the first 6 months. But if they choose to leave after 6 months of their arrival, the only way they can stay legal in the country is to prove that they have been trafficked, a measure that makes it all too easy for migrants to become illegal, regardless of their background. Surveillance, then, exerts a unique pressure on undocumented migrant workers. As a system of the state, surveillance depends on regimes of visibility and invisibility that surface existing threats and use cues to profile potential threats. The presence of guards and other patrolling or surveillance entities in high traffic areas such as bus stops and centers for social services effectively act like walls that keep undocumented people from moving through and within these supposedly public spaces. Undocumented Filipina domestic workers in London navigate the city similarly. The respondents in McKay's study of care work detail how they avoid going on the underground and even the buses in fear of being approached by immigration officers. They would often choose to walk, taking the long ways through the city to avoid being seen in high traffic areas. I argue here that Gabriella London's public portrayal of undocumented workers counters the UK's hegemonic appraisal and surveillance of migrants in the UK. Their move toward a blurred counter visibility deconstructs the perceived binary between the power of visibility and the impotence of invisibility, according to Phelan. When asked about the blurring in the posts, Niel emphasized that it was ultimately important for them to include even just the skin or the silhouette of the undocumented workers to lend not only urgency, but also a material link to the calls and narratives of vulnerability that they are communicating. However, being seen does not singularly bring one into political and collective action. It means that undocumented migrants also enter into a field of gazes that could determine their corporeal and affective life. These lead young undocumented migrants to learn to be illegal, a process replete with ambiguities of visibility and invisibility, and which requires new daily routines, social patterns, survival strategies of mere tactics to get by, according to Block and Zetter. The workers' calculated yet strained movement in the city is both urgent and fleeting. There are strict rules or strategies one must follow to avoid surveillance as much as possible. But these can so easily change as well, given their lack of material and social stability. The burden of this navigation is primarily borne by the body. Willen brings up the concept of somatic modes of attention, a condition of hyper-awareness of the body in his article on the objectivity of illegal migrant workers from the Philippines and Israel. In this context, illegal or undocumented migrants are confined to their homes, which causes feelings of isolation and hopelessness to grow. Niel described the experience of undocumented workers in the UK as like that of mga daga sa estero. Some would not leave their houses at all for anything, in fear of their presence being registered. This leads some to stay inside their homes for years, especially when the pandemic began. Feminist surveillance studies highlights how the use of surveillance practices and technologies to normalize and maintain whiteness, able-bodiedness, capitalism, heterosexuality practices are integral to the foundation of the modern state. These strategies manifest directly from the wide and stringent use of identity cards and passports at borders to the security and traffic cameras in urban landscapes that disproportionately affect the presence and movements of non-white, disabled women and LGBTQ communities. The physicality and sociality of the urban space is not the only place in which these strategies are played out. Social media has broadened what public space means and how it appears, making it particularly salient for undocumented migrants' approach to counter visibility. One way of looking at this conflation of virtual and real space is through the efforts of undocumented people on social media to document their experience and express their political struggles publicly. This exercise of agency transcends how undocumented migrants are often punitively fixed in space. In social media, they are able to circulate themselves and their actions to broader audiences, and more importantly, other undocumented migrants, according to Schreiber. Some of the strategies that migrant collectives, according to Niel, have employed over the years are voice changers, erasing messages, and using older phones rather than smart ones. The potential offered by the virtual space, however, is not without its challenges. The workers also explain how an undocumented status could negatively affect the social dynamics in the Filipino workers' community in London, given their intertwined vulnerabilities as precarious workers. As migrants engaging in underpaid and oftentimes informal work, they depend on each other for material and emotional support. The church that you see here is an example of where the support network is nurtured and sustained. During a conversation with the Filipino migrant workers at All Saints Church in Battersea, the community spoke about how they come together every Sunday to hear Mass, relax, and ask for help regarding job opportunities, legal advice, and housing concerns. These relationships, however, can grow into more ambiguous expressions of dependence and paranoia. They've expressed worry over their peers learning of anyone becoming irregular. It is possible that they would cut their association with them or that they would not be paid the debts they are owed due to impending deportation. This shows that surveillance is not enacted solely by the state, as it finds its way within the gazes of the community itself. The affective and material dependence among workers is necessarily tied to how they view and appraise one another's status. Facebook, in particular, is a charged space wherein these appraisals occur. Undocumented workers curate their presence here to make up for the irregularity of their visa and sustain previous social relationships despite the fickle nature of their work and living conditions. If they post too much about their lives in London, it is possible that their precise location and visa status will reach the authorities. If they do not post at all, the absolute online invisibility would be taken as a sign of hiding, therefore compromising the veteran and stable status that they have built as a worker in London over the years. McKay refers to this as an act of prosthetic citizenship, which decenters the role of the state in defining and surveilling the movements and presence of undocumented migrant workers in public spaces. I engage with the story because it signifies how undocumented migrant workers perceive and make use of social media, the very space in which the visual materials from activist collectives are disseminated. As the target audience of the posts of Gabriella London, their engagement with the materials is necessarily framed by this navigation of invisibility. The posts highlighted in this analysis, I argue, attempt to address these frayed connections by deliberately showing how these vulnerabilities are lived out and imbuing them with political potential and even joy. In viewing these materials, we may recall the image of the resilient Filipino in time of ecological and political crisis. This idea that with every blow or injury, the self is expected to recover. Resilience, in some, revolves around shock absorption, according to Brock. This paradigm of shock absorption is recontextualized and glitched by the juxtaposition of the blurred face and the smiling one. Here is a resilience and a visibility that challenges our gaze and the norms with which we appraise the survival of vulnerable populations. Overall, the tenuousness of visibility that has been highlighted so far is a manifestation of vulnerability in the way that visibility situates marginalized people simultaneously in a place of powerlessness and political potential. The social, political, and affective strain that this mode of navigating the public space imposes upon the workers shows the burden and struggle within attempts to be visible. Given this, I read the blurred faces of the undocumented women as a direct interruption and insistence of their complex presence. This counter visibility operates on a kind of self-censorship, a deliberate partial erasure of the self that politically and discursively communicates the marginalized community's command of their own perception. This kind of representation is sensitive to the strategic potential of remaining just below the radar of state forces. Being invisible in this way helps in regrouping and strengthening collective bonds in preparation for visible action, according to Hildebrandt and Chua. The blur, I argue, registers one's presence as it evades recognition and therefore surveillance. Overall, digital ethnography's attention to the non-digital is significant in weaving together insights that fall in the spaces between the social media posts analyzed here, as evidenced by the wealth of stories and histories that Gabriella London have offered me through both online and offline correspondence. The discussion has stressed how there's no hard binary between the online and the offline, and how digital ethnography's attention to the offline demonstrates the permeability of online content and the narratives that drive their presence on our screens. The study's weaving together of the relatively concise language and imagery of the social media posts with the more fluid and context-specific conversations with migrant labor groups demonstrates this blurring of the digital and physical boundary. Ultimately, this study foregrounds the ways in which vulnerability and resistance are claimed and animated under the crises that existing patriarchal and neoliberal structures have particularly imposed upon undocumented migrant workers. I have discussed how a feminist migrant labor group manages these compounded vulnerabilities and mobilizes the precarious conditions and affects within them toward resistance and collective action. The blurring of the faces and the composition of the text is a link between online messages and material vulnerabilities, and they appeal to both grassroots organizing and institutional agents to alleviate the struggles of undocumented workers, especially during the pandemic. These discursive directions allow for group recognition and identification that makes their collective operations visible in the fluid and swiftly changing face of social media. I have argued that the blurred faces insist on a presence that eludes the eye of the surveilling state, a counter-visibility that draws its potency from the covert yet public coming together of the community with and for undocumented migrant workers. These materials serve both subversive and educational functions, as they help migrant workers and the public here and in the UK know their position and potential under the systems that dictate so much of their lives. So that is the end of my lecture. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Julie, for that presentation. So now we will accept questions. You may raise your hand or you may write your question in the chat box. So, any questions or okay. Marby?
Hello. Okay ba yung audio ko? Not sure. Kailangan talaga itanong yan every time, no? Congratulations, Julie, on such a coherent, no, presentation. I really appreciated kind of, oh God, I really appreciated kind of this look into the experiences, no, of undocumented workers in the UK and how um, the idea of making oneself visible, pero also not visible because of real life threats. No, um, I'm probably siguro just to foreground my question. I'm interested kasi in how development organizations, in this case, no, yung Gabriela London, no, also view the vulnerability of migrants. And their counter-visible attempts and the counter-visibility attempts of marginalized groups. No? So, parang tatlong questions to. I hope you forgive me. Pero they actually are connected. So, isa lang naman yung sagot. Parang papunta sa isang sagot in the end. No? So, yung unang question is, how much of the messaging in the FB groups of Gabriela London are actually reflective of critiquing conditions of undocumented workers, and how much of this is determined by its connection to the agenda of the main branch, no, in the Philippines? Kasi yung pinakita mo, for example, na kanina sa post, no, meron of course about the undocumented workers, pero meron din about conditions in the Philippines, no, yung Duterte presidency and militarization and such. So yun yung parang first question, which leads me to the next, which is, who is the intended audience for these posts then, kung ganon, right? Kung dalawa yung messaging na ganon. And who is expected to act or react to these posts, diba? And then, siguro, ito na yung final doon is, how does Gabriela London then, considering ito yung, ano nga, no, ito yung context niya and yung purpose for the messaging, navigate it, how does Gabriela London actually navigate the highlighting of experiences against the actual threat of exposure or possible criminality and deportation that happens, no, with the threat of exposure? I hope that makes sense, Julie, no? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marvy. And actually, it touches on a lot of the surrounding research that I did in preparing this study. So first, when you asked about how Gabriela London perceives this blurriness or this particular representation, immediately when I talk to them and seeing the comments on these posts as well, it's always a triumphant approach. This is a moment of, look, we have persisted. So from the perspective of the organizers, it is deliberate and they want to portray themselves as having triumphed over all the hurdles. Regarding this, your question on how it relates to the agenda of Gabriela as a coalition, right? One of the reasons I picked Gabriela because it's one of the one of the chapters in my research actually goes into transnational solidarity building. So it was important for me to pick labor groups that have home bases and how they simultaneously talk about, again, part of my discussion of digitalness and fluidity, how they're very much firmly physically restricted in the UK and in the Netherlands. I also talked to Migrante. But their messages sort of go beyond where they are. So in terms of the composition of their Facebook page, it's a mix match, really. You would have a collection of posts that they have created themselves. So with Gabriela London, it's mostly about undocumented workers. And then they've also told me that they have to mirror posts from other Facebook pages, which then deal with the Duterte administration and the UK. So there's no one logic to it, and there's many social media managers that produce. I mentioned earlier how Niel was trying to pick up where people have been exhausted, and so he is also just one of many managers, and then they all sort of just see what has been posted and then they repost, or if they have a recent triumph with having reached an undocumented worker, then they will have a post that they create for that. So on the audience, I mentioned earlier that the audience for this is primarily also undocumented migrant workers. And they wanted the look of it, the text of it to be simple. They wanted it to seem like kind of joyful as well. Because one of the technological divide in the community, so not everyone can always access internet, or not everyone could sort of read through lots of text. So it had to be quite direct. And they encourage undocumented migrants to also seek for them. So in whatever way this can happen. So sometimes they receive messages on their Facebook page, and then they sort of navigate how to talk without really revealing where they are. So these are kind of negotiations. And the people that react and who they're for are both across all migrant workers in the UK, but also they're also being shown to the general public. One of them has talked about boosting the posts, paying Facebook to boost the posts. And in that sense, it's no longer just for migrant workers. It's also for everyone that live in London who are, proximity to the group, and then it would come up on their Facebook feeds. So it's very diffuse, the approach to showcasing or representing undocumented migrant laborers. But their very primary goal, at least from the organizer side, is to encourage other migrant workers to reach out, undocumented workers to reach out to them. Because a lot of them, as I mentioned earlier, really, some actually just died at home because they refused to go out. So it was a very difficult thing. So that's their first sort of goal with the posts.
Thank you, Julie. Kasi sorry, no, follow up lang dun sa question. Hindi to one-on-one. Kasi kaya ako interested dun. Kasi I was trying to figure out who who yung iniisip nila kasi na pwedeng mag-provide ng interventions considering these conditions, di ba? So
Yeah.
sometimes you create posts kasi gusto mo may policy, kunyari, na effect yan.
Yeah.
Kaya yun yung, I think, my question about the audience. Yung
And I
sino
can-
yung may capability and power. Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for reminding me of that question. So yes, actually, in the chapter that I wrote that includes this, the other set of materials is literally them with instructions on how to navigate the home office. So it's writing workshops. It's both. It's quite interesting. So they have on one end these very direct critiques of the UK's the Home Office and the Duterte administration, how they kind of feed into it to each other, but also they have posts that go into this is how you apply your to be legal, or this is how to appeal your status, and these have a very different tone compared to the undocumented social media posts. They are instructional, and they invite people to attend writing workshops. It was actually really interesting because they kept mentioning how it was important for the migrant workers themselves, undocumented people, to write about their own experiences in English. So there's also that sort of appeal to the language of the institution because they are still talking to the institution. So they're doing both, trying to be covert, but really because of they are a group that has a space and that has to contend with the legal system to help the people that approach them. They navigate that. So they are also appealing to institutions.
Thank you. All good now with my question.
Thanks,
Okay, thank you,
Marbs.
Marby. Other questions? Again, you may also write your questions in the chat box. Maaga pa ba masyado? Okay, Christian.
Am I visible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Visible, yes.
So thank you so much, Julie, for that talk. I suppose I guess I just had one question because when you're talking about how migrants experience their precarity, it reminded me of what I call this Butler's work on performative. Wait, let me check this. Like performative theory of assembly. Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, this idea of a kind of like a recognition of shared precarity in a way is, I mean, ideally, it's just the first step towards solidarity building. So I was wondering, like, at least if I would like to ask if you could, like, I'm not sure if I missed it, but if you could speak more about how the migrant workers experience their precarity, and has it actually led to solidarity with other kinds of groups, at least within London, or at least
Yeah.
even international?
Yeah. Thanks for this question, and I think it brings up a really important point in the study, which is, so I talked about surveillance earlier, but when we think about surveillance, it's always from the eye of the state, right? The state has all of these mechanisms, but actually, what's so precarious as well with being together in this state as undocumented workers is they begin to surveil each other. So one of the difficult things really that get in the way, or that informs so much of how they perform their solidarity and how they enact it in social media, is because they come from difficult encounters with each other. So they surveil each other, they watch out, or is this person undocumented? I mean, I haven't heard from her in a while. Oh no, what could happen? She owes me money, and therefore, if she's undocumented, she might not pay me. So kind of this paranoia about each other's status. And so that's one of the main ways in which this performance of solidarity is informed by that difficultness. So, which is why the images that I've highlighted, and this is across other images as well. There's always an undercurrent of joy, or not undercurrent, but really an outward exposure to joy, because they come out of these very difficult situations where people do not want to talk at some point. They just want to hide themselves, or they have a very specific representation of where they are so that they will not be questioned. So this exposure to it, and this representation of happiness, even though it's blurred, is the response of the group to that kind of relationship. So that's sort of how they are interacting with one another. So apart from earlier encouraging other migrant workers to reach out, other undocumented people to reach out to them for help, it's also, the second one is really to repair and to sort of restore trust in the community by showing that, hey, it's not their fault, kumbaga, that they're not documented. It's a crisis of several levels. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Francis Tang. Okay,
Hello. Am I audible? Okay. All right. So, first, thank you and congratulations, Julie, on that presentation. I wanted to ask because I'm your presentation reminded me a lot of Sarah Ahmed's writing on on effective political rhetoric, and parts of the rhetoric that she's analyzed have gone into migrants, specifically to the UK. But her rhetoric, the rhetoric that she analyzed, that the texts in the public sphere that she analyzed, was more on looking at how the white body um perceives itself as being penetrated by the migrant, and so it's more of that perspective.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to ask, since you did look into more on the other side of it, um aside from, I caught the metaphor you mentioned, yung daga sa estero. Aside from that, were there other metaphors or effective rhetorical sort of patterns that these migrant groups would use to refer to themselves, or ways of sort
Yeah.
of being inclusive of their sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, constituents?
Yeah. Thanks for this, Fang. And definitely, I had to write about affect in the thesis as well, because that's one of the, like, if you were to ask this question of the burden of fighting for their rights falls on exhausted shoulders, right? It's always the vulnerable people, which I have argued in the study is a good thing, like they know it intimately and all of that. But at the same time, materially, it's not as sustainable, specifically because of this affective dimension of exhaustion. I think that's my direct answer to your question. I had actually a look at the page of Gabriela London recently, and they're not active anymore. They've been rebranded, and then they went into I think they become absorbed into the Filipino Domestic Workers Association, and they still do blurring. There are posts from, like, scattered across the months, where they post about people who have, as a way to kind of cohere the community, people who are exhausted, people who nagtiyaga para umusad. So this affect of um going on and fighting through, which is a precursor to this triumph that I've mentioned earlier. So that's one of the key sort of connecting, oh my gosh, the key connecting ideas and affects, sorry about the filter, that they also have. Another one is, of course, anger. So I think it wasn't as stressed in the post that I analyzed, but there were also a lot of material on expressing anger against the Duterte administration, expressing anger against immigration officers. So these two emotions, along with joy, sort of form the affective network that animates the messaging of their posts.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Fang.
Thank you, Fan. Okay, so here's a question from Lauren. I think I'll just read it. Um, Hi, Julie. Congratulations on the lecture. I was wondering how these conditions that you discuss in the lecture, both on the side of the migrants and Gabriela, have since changed or adjusted since London, the UK, has opened up to the rest of the world post-pandemic. Partially, you touched on this when you said earlier that the group has merged with another migrant group, if I got that right. Or in the case of during the pandemic, how did Gabriela reach out to the undocumented migrants if they got the virus but could not easily access healthcare? Was this also done through the social media pages? Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Lauren. So on the first question, so how has the UK sort of and London opened up since the pandemic, with more restrictions on the presence of migrants specifically. So actually, it's quite the timing is so good for the lecture, because in the end of April just this year, they passed into law the Rwanda Act. So I don't know if you have heard of it, but the idea is, if anyone who seeks asylum, who came to the UK through another country and didn't seek asylum there, they would be flown to Rwanda as a safe third country. So very strange. And so that is one of the issues actually that the Filipino Domestic Workers Association in London at the moment is sort of managing in their community. Like, what does this mean for us? Who is at risk of being deported to the safe third country that is Rwanda, and the process of deportation, and of course, what to do when you are detained. One of them recently just went to the Home Office for a meeting about their status and was detained and was not sort of informed that they had already reached a decision. She was just detained when she went to the Home Office. So and the second, so that's it, with more basically cracking down on the movements of migrants. And this is not just in the UK, this is happening across Europe as well. And the second question, during the pandemic, how did Gabriela reach out to the undocumented migrants? So this is really interesting because social media and the internet is sort of one of the main ways in which they disseminate their calls, right, or their encouragement for people, so that if a person who knows an undocumented person sees this, they could tell the undocumented person. Not doesn't have to be like the undocumented person having to see it for themselves. As I noticed, there's a technological divide in the community, so kind of relying on those networks. So and then because there are limitations to social media and the internet, they quickly go into more analog techniques to actually reach the people. So I mentioned earlier how they would, some of them prefer to use the disposable phones, and they would just text. They wouldn't really be online. And so that's how they were able to manage connections beyond and because of the social media space. And if they got the virus, so one of the ways in which they do this is they literally just go to the place of the undocumented worker, and then they give the aid. And the aid is really just food and whatever medicine that they have raised through efforts. So they just go there. There was not much, oh, I can't go because you have the virus. They just go, and then with social distance and all of that. So all coming from these connections that go in and out of the social media digital space. Thanks, Lauren.
Okay, thanks, Lord, for that question. Here's a follow-up from Puching. As a follow-up to Marby's earlier questions, what were the responses to the FB posts? Were you able to get data on how many read, reacted, shared, or commented on the posts? I can imagine the OFW's positive comments or direct personal messages, but aside from that.
Yeah, so what I noticed, because I also looked into it, though it wasn't really part of the analysis, but I did look into how viral some of them can get, and what I have seen and what they have also told me through my interviews with them is that the people that react and sort of engage with the posts are sort of also within the migrant network. It's mostly that audience that they find sort of communication and engagement from. Yeah, OFW's positive comments or direct personal messages. But aside from that, they have also talked about the trolls. Of course, it's not, I mean, the OFWs do not have a singular reaction and experience of being a migrant. So a lot of them also quite difficult, and this came up a lot in our conversations. They have to deal with trolls that because they critique Duterte's administration, because they talk about undocumented workers and illegality and all of these things. They've also received a lot of hate. And how they deal with it is they do not engage with them. So they sort of delete the comments as they happen, or they ignore the comments. So it's really not, you're right, there are a lot of positive comments from the community, but they also deal with people that are maybe acting on the directive to quash dissent, whether that is people from the Philippines or people who are there as well. Yes, thanks for the question, Ma'am Puching.
May is raising her hand, so maybe we'll take May's question first before we go to the ones in the chat.
Hello. This is just out of pure curiosity. I was wondering, you were talking about trolls and all. How common or did people threaten each other to report them for deportation? Was that something that came up in the radar?
In the interviews, there were allusions to that being possible, but I have not received like confirmation that it has happened. But that is a fear among
Yeah.
others. So it adds to the paranoia of it. They know, and therefore they can. If I don't pay my debt, if I don't perform in a certain way. So
Yeah, actually, I imagine ultimately the vulnerability lies at diba? A major
that.
factor of vulnerability is you're illegal, and then home office is just a call away, and
Yeah.
uh yeah, and they've been yeah. Okay, thank you. Just out of curiosity, thanks. All well
Thanks,
done so
Mami.
far.
Thank you. And there's Ma'am, you're muted, Mamay.
Sorry, yeah, Shinbi, and then Christine after Chin. Then we'll go to the questions in the chat. Okay, thank you.
Hey, Julie. Thank you for that great presentation. Very interesting. Um, and this is also a question out of curiosity because you mentioned writing workshops. So I'm just interested if you're familiar with how if you ever got to attend, or if you're familiar with how they're organized, what they're for. What happens, who goes. I mean, super general lang, ano, na just a sense of because yeah, I'm finding that writing workshops have a role in these situations now, and I think even questions of like audience, like who are well, like what are these posts for, and you mentioned earlier kind of two-pronged, they're for other migrant workers, other undocumented workers, and then of course there's the institutional level also. But how and I'm coming from the just a sense also of that long haul effort where, before you can even talk about lobbying towards institutions, no, there's the kind of a long haul process of even just the basic understanding your rights, no, practical safety, and even immediate assistance. And from the few experiences I've had, it seems these workshops do become an opportunity, and then they're offline. No? So, well, syempre nung pandemic, baka nag-change din yun, ano. But it does become like kind of very simple opportunity for getting together and then getting to know other people, and then practicing articulating your experiences, and uh, uh, um, I'm also I've done this in a few other places aside from the Philippines, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and I'm amazed at how kasi kind of abusive no situations where one day a month lang yung day off mo, and people would actually be interested to go and write, no, which was like
Yeah.
amazing. That people would actually wanna spend their free time, no, because you were also discussing vulnerability and exhaustion, and how there are certain assumptions we make. Like I had assumed that if you're exhausted and vulnerable and you don't have much free time, it wouldn't occur to you to make art, or to and
Yeah.
yeah, no, these are sites for this kind of um creativity and community building. So I was just wondering about if ever you got to see, and then how they worked, and just anything that you can share with us.
Thank you, Chingvi. Yes, so I was also very much piqued when they started talking about writing workshops, because really they were tailored to what the home office will ask of them when they appeal or when they apply to be regular. So the writing workshops, what I could remember from the interview was that they practiced writing about how they got to the UK and how to describe their abuse. So those two crucial ways. So they're quite pragmatic, but there are also a lot of the more creative writing that happens. And so when it comes to how they work, they are offline. So I got to spend time with Gabriela London and the Domestic Workers Association in July 2021. And so it was a bit open. And so there were more in-person activities at that point. But before that, of course, everything was sort of over on Zoom. And of course, technological divide. And as you mentioned, some people do not have a lot of time off. So that's also something that they had to navigate. And then, of course, when you mentioned earlier regarding the long haul process of before you even get to the point of writing about your life and appealing for status, you also first have to sort of understand and believe in the language of that, which is through knowing your rights and why you are. Have you been trafficked? Have you not been trafficked? The idea of abuse, what counts as abuse, because a lot of it also gets naturalized. An interesting point here is one of the workers could not really say something about the minimum wage that she gets for, despite her having overtime and doing a lot of extra work. She can't do anything because her employers tell her, we paid for your legal fees, or we paid for your ticket. So all of these negotiations of, and then they think, oh, well, yeah, I mean, my employers did pay, so I really can't say anything. So because of that, the consortium and the Domestic Workers Association, in as part of the writing workshops, or maybe before that also, ongoing really, and are more frequent actually, the awareness raising gatherings. And what's interesting is they sometimes also happen at mass. So they go to the church and then they have mass, and then the homily and the sort of speech after is from one of the organizers. So yes, that's the how it works, in at least in what I was able to witness.
Thank you. Great, Julie. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chinbi. Uh, we have a question. Actually, Christine first. Christine is raising her hand. Christine.
Thank you po, Ma'am Ai, and thank you, Julie, for your very interesting presentation. It got me thinking about my own experiences as well with field work among migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong. Apologies for not turning on my camera as I'm not quite alive at this hour. So my question relates to your point about vulnerability and visibility as resistance. And I was just wondering if you could speak more about in what conditions vulnerability and visibility count as resistance in the context of the pandemic and the conditions of isolation and social distancing it has imposed, and in the context of the emergence and increasing use of digital forms of political demonstration. And I ask this question also in relation to the earlier questions by Marby about the political efficacy of these forms of organizing, and also Christian's point about Butler's notes toward a performative theory of assembly. As you remember, Butler wrote that book in response to the Occupy protests that were very prevalent around the late 2008 and so forth, with the Occupy movements in New York and Hong Kong, etc. And um, Butler's critique in that book is that these forms of political demonstration, which demand the formation of plural collectivities, and then the appearance of these plural collectivities in the space of the public, politically they become um, ineffective, because after the moment of assembly, when this assembly disperses, the political energy and efficacy of the movement also diffuses. Diba? So in the context of Hong Kong kasi you focus more on the like the posts online of the migrant workers and the undocumented workers. In the context of Hong Kong kasi, the appearance in the physical space, uh in order to construct visibility, is very important for their political agenda, like campaigning for ayuda from the Hong Kong government and the Philippine government, campaigning for raising the minimum wage, etc. So appearance in the physical space, and then the photographing of that appearance in the physical space, and then disseminating those photographs in the digital space. Parang they're connected, and the appearance in the physical is very important. So I was just wondering um how that appearance in the space of the physical, as what constitutes political visibility, how that changes in the context of your field work when the people, like the undocumented workers, cannot appear in the physical space. So I was just wondering to what extent that counts, to what extent vulnerability can count as resistance when, one, you have the condition of these impediments towards the formation of a collective body. So that's one. And then second, when visibility is impeded, not only because of the precarity of the undocumented body, but also because of the conditions of the pandemic, where they cannot form visibly in public spaces as a collectivity because there's social distancing, and so on. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if that question was very clear, but
Yes,
yeah.
it was. It was. Thank you so much, Tin. And really, what you described in the way that workers in Hong Kong operate and act agency and discursively assert their rights is not unrelated. It's actually very similar to what goes on in the UK. But of course, there was the added impediment, as you mentioned, of not only the surveillance of London as and the UK as a state, but also the pandemic. So one, it was very interesting actually because it was a moment of experimentation. So because everyone had to be could not go out to mobilize physically, for the context of Gabriela London, it was very lucky that they were all living in the same house anyway. And that's mostly because they had to rescue people. And so over the years, they have managed to get like a house somewhere in London where the social media managers go home to after their shifts. And this house also has a space for people to come in when they get rescued. Another way in which they were so that's one good thing that worked from them. But I mentioned experimentation because they also tried to do noise barrage protests online. So that was quite interesting, and how they also admitted that it didn't really have that effect, right, of being able to have a barrage and disturb people in the physical space. So how vulnerability manifests in that time is really through, or at least engaging with it, and not merely just diminishing, as I mentioned in my lecture, is engaging in that process of experimentation. So let's see what we can do online. And then whether physical stuff could be transferred, like noise barrage protests, or another more of a different kind naman. They have like Zumba workshops online, and that they live stream on their Facebook. So whoever is able to be visible in that sense could be visible. So they were just looking at ways that they could transfer, but also at some point they were able to kind of center on the kind of content that I've mentioned in other questions. So this idea of mirroring posts, right? And creating their own for undocumented workers. And how the vulnerability itself manifests as resistance is really through the people who are vulnerable themselves. And this is quite material. The people who are vulnerable themselves being the ones that create their own representation. And they are negotiating, or they are sort of making decisions about what people know about them. So it's sort of a strategic use of their stories, of their own stories, because we know that there are a lot of stories that abound regarding undocumented workers. So, and then another way in which the resistance occurs, or parang the consequence, or the what they are working toward in animating and claiming vulnerability, as resistance is really getting people out. So one of it for people who have abusive, who are in abusive conditions. So for people who need aid, as seen in the social media posts, there are photos of that, and then they have to be disseminated to show, to restore trust and to restore joy, right? But also it's being able to enable other people to escape. So that's another way in which resistance happens. So through this visibility of the vulnerabilities of undocumented workers, it actually allows other people to get out. And into this home, or the homes that they have a list of like people that undocumented workers could run to in when they are able to escape. And so yes, that's sort of my answer to how vulnerability is animated toward resistance, and not just, no, I am not vulnerable. Actually, I am vulnerable, and this is what vulnerability affords me. And more importantly, the connections, the interdependencies that these vulnerabilities operate on, but are also the product of. So yeah.
Thank you, Julie. Just a quick clarification lang about what you said. When you use the word resistance, am I right in understanding that what these workers are resisting are the surveillance and the invisibilizing forces of the state?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
So yeah,
You.
the whole idea that they are watched and they are watched to be punished. So yeah.
All right. Thank you. Let's have Itos, let's have some of the questions in the chat first. So here's a question from Marby. Did Brexit have an effect on these increased border restrictions and general racist altering attitudes towards certain migrant groups? Curious lang. I think this
Yes.
is related to a question asked earlier.
Yes. So it cemented really the national sentiment toward them, and it actually has a very recent history of it's not just Filipino migrants really. It's actually, when you think, I've asked like people in the UK about what they think when they think of undocumented migrant, and it's more often people of African descent. So actually, Filipinos are occupying a very specific space because a lot of their national health service is held up by Filipinos. A lot of their domestic workers are Filipinos. But they don't really see, or they don't really immediately think of Filipinos as undocumented in that sense, because they sort of are there and keep society alive. But they don't also afford them the rights. So that kind of interplay among, again, as I mentioned in the lecture, illegality is a racial construct by the UK. So it hierarchizes your races, and we know this in filling out forms, right? Like you have to say what kind of race you are. In my experience, I was Southeast Asian other. So I'm not even in the form. So things like that Brexit sort of cemented. So definitely, yes.
All right. All right. Thank you, Julie. Here's another question from Vic. I'm asking this question because of my interest in religion. Beyond just offering a space for Filipino migrants to come together and interdepend on one another, did the local church also offer aid and participate in resistance? For example, did the clergy serving Filipinos in London also try to extend aid while avoiding exposing the undocumented status of mass goers? Did values taught in church, like unconditional love and forgiveness, make Filipinos check themselves from pressuring their fellow migrants with surveillance? If this is already outside of the scope, no worries. I would love to hear any of your thoughts about the role religion plays in the relationship between vulnerability and interdependence.
Thanks so much, Vic. So yes, one of the pictures that I showed earlier was in their church when I was able to attend one of their masses. So yeah, the local church and the clergy there is interestingly a mix of, at least at the time, a mix of Southeast Asian clergy. So I think there was a Bangladeshi priest that officiated, that did the mass, and then it was a room full of Filipinos. Like Oh, so your question on the values taught at church, I think for the most part, Filipinos have a very weird relationship with these ideas, right, of unconditional love and forgiveness, advocating for them, but in the same breath, sort of not extending the same. And it comes from what I've mentioned earlier regarding this paranoia, because they themselves are precarious. So the idea is that if I'm precarious, if it's so easy for me to be illegal, if I am associated with someone illegal or someone doing criminal behavior or staying here illegally, then I must not be associated with them because I have to preserve my own. So it comes from this difficult interdependence. And I believe religion, at least from what I have witnessed, offers a space in which those anxieties could be worked out. So yeah, because they literally meet at a church and the church allows for these difficult conversations to arise. So yeah, thank you, Vic.
You may want to ask your question now, Itos.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am I, and thank you, Julie. Really interesting discussion so far. I was just curious because you mentioned earlier efforts toward transnational solidarity, and I do remember, like for example, governmentally that Southeast Asians are almost rendered like literally othered in like government forms that you did mention that like you say that you're other Asian or something like that. I was just curious if in the present, because you did mention that Gabriela UK was kind of subsumed under a larger organization. If there are, how do you say this? If for example the specific forms of vulnerability and precarity that are imposed on like Filipino undocumented workers are kind of connected to this broader struggle of other migrant workers and also perhaps like other workers in general. I mean, like in the broadest sense, like other labor organizations in the UK. So I'm just curious. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a great question because it's very telling. One, Gabriela London, it was Gabriela London in 2021, and then it became Gabriela UK, and then they weren't very active, at least in the online space. And I started seeing the people that I saw with Gabriela London be more active in Filipino Domestic Workers Association in the UK, which is the bigger group. So I feel that of course there might have been some strains there from organizing that I am not privy to, so I wouldn't know. Um, and then how they, which tells me, and I say this as they've been subsumed under Filipino domestic workers, is it looks like they are centering, or at least the move is to reach out to, of course, it's not only Filipinos that are domestic workers. A lot of them are also from the African diaspora and from the South Asian diaspora. So in that sense, because it becomes more of a domestic workers association, it opens itself up to the plight and the to extending help, of course, to people who are not just from the Filipino diaspora. And with regard to other kinds of jobs or other migrant laborers, I was not able to talk with them about this. And of course, their posts sort of just focus on domestic work as a unique experience. But the uh, posts that I've mentioned earlier regarding writing workshops and masses are open to everyone. So everyone who is undocumented and would like help in navigating the home office to appeal their status or to apply their status. So in that sense, it has a very specific situating of itself within domestic work and the Filipino experience, but also just because of how connected, right? It's everyone's interdependent. It has space for other groups and transnational solidarity in that sense, all coming from very precarious spaces but very potent as well, in my opinion. So thank you, Itos.
Thanks, Julie.
All right, thank you. We have a few more questions here, and I think some of the these questions are related to the questions asked earlier. So I'll look at the ones that kind of move towards a new direction so that we will hear more, right? Okay, of like some of the other aspects of the research. But also, because we do have a lot of questions now, parang nagising na tayo lahat, but we also need to deliberate. Okay, we need time to deliberate. So let me just, this is a question from Joseph. Congrats, Julie. Out of curiosity, does Gabriela network with other non-Pinoy migrant orgs in London or UK, like Refugee Action and Asylum Aid? I am curious how the responses and efforts compare to other migrant groups in the UK. And I think this is the one that's kind of like also a new direction. Also, how much have they organized their work around specific cultural tendencies, and how much of it speaks to institutions overseas? Okay, so, Julie.
Okay. So the main parang intergroup connections and solidarity I've seen are across first Filipino organizations. So there's Gabriela London at the time, there's Filipino Domestic Workers Association UK, and then there's Kanlungan Filipino Consortium. So those three groups are the ones that have a very set network of they will support each other's causes, they will repost each other's messages and all of that. When I attended a demonstration with them, I saw Stand Up to Racism as one of the groups that the non-migrant group that was also there. With regard to Refugee Action and Asylum Aid, I assume they would also be in talks with people from there just because they're also appealing to the Home Office. So with regard to accessing the institution, as you also ask in your question. So regarding specific cultural tendencies, definitely. So we've talked a bit about the masses earlier. They also have they have potlucks, so they have boodle fights, they have Zumba classes, and so these not so part of the restorative resistive work is caring for one another, right? So it's as they critique, as they do workshops, they also have these moments of just sitting down with each other if they have free time and caring for one another, repairing whatever, or helping each other through exhaustion. And that's very culturally defined. So food, a lot of once there was a makeup session. So yeah, so these things. And how much of it speaks to institutions overseas, they're able to work with NGOs, I suppose, in London at the time, because I would also see filmmakers sometimes come and have like a review session with them or to film them. So it's not, they have worked with the Home Office, but also they have connections with non-institutional, but also quite in the vein of collective groups. So yeah.
So I think our last question is Irish's question. Bawal na ha. That's going to be our last question. But we have two more here. One from, this is Kit question. Going off on Tin's question on the notion of resistance, is the political consciousness of the migrants in recognizing the political aspect of their experience accommodating of the necessity of organization and mobilization? How do they negotiate the ingratiating nature of OFW infrastructure designed to stunt the political consciousness of our human export?
Okay. So I think they go about this through a very personal route. So I mentioned earlier how there are lots of opportunities, at least the groups try to create for them to come together and to bridge that gap of, you know, their whatever political consciousness that the group would the group thinks would aid them in their resistance and also in appealing their status, whatever political consciousness that is, it already comes from how they arrived and how they perceive things that they maybe recognize or already or don't recognize about their own stories as migrant laborers. So part of that work is first having a storytelling session and talking about their own lives, because that's where this political consciousness, at least from the perspective of the groups in the UK that I've talked to, that's their in. Like that's how they sort of make sure that when they write, or if they participate in protest actions, that it's tied to what brought you here, and how you're having been brought here in certain situations, or having gone here in certain situations, is not, an isolated story. It's a story that's also with everyone that is in that space with you. So there's that. The appeal to the personal story is very important. And of course, I've mentioned earlier with regard to your last question, Kit, they have both. They have opportunities, or moments and meetings where they have to have the language of the institution, because there's a very real threat, or people want to get legal, so they have that. But within these meetings, they also ensure, or at least in the agenda and in the messaging of it, that this is something that they have to do because of and not because they are wrong in being there, but because they are the product, or their experiences are a product of a lot of things that that are beyond their control, that they were born into. So the personal, and of course having that sort of flexibility in critiquing and coming up with artistic ways of resistance, but also for the legality of some people who want to apply, to have that opportunity for them as well. So yes.
Okay, and we go to our final question. Hi, Julie. Congratulations. My curiosity is more towards your experiences during the non-digital fieldwork. So we turn the gaze. How was it like accessing Gabriela as an organization, and how was the reception towards you as a researcher, given that the issue you looked into had to do with migrants with precarious status in the UK? Thank you and big congrats.
Thanks so much, Irish. Yeah, and I love that the last question I ended with this idea of the personal, because I also was very I didn't know how it would go. It was a pandemic. All that I could do really is message them on Facebook to ask if it's possible to research with them and do whatever they are comfortable with, and all of that. So my experience in accessing the organization is really through Niel Camilon, the person that I spoke to, who is no longer an organizer. He moved to Bangkok with his husband. So I just sent a message, and then Niel responded on Messenger as well. And it was a very like personal, and it was, I want to say low key, but it was very direct. There were no other sort of, I didn't have to write a letter. I didn't have to talk to anyone else but the person who answered my question on their Facebook page. And I guess that's a testament to how their operations work. There are a lot of them that handle the social media pages, and some of them live in the same house. So I ask a question, they answer, and I assume anyone who asks a question, whether it be a researcher or someone who needs help, would be dealt with or would be answered in the same way. You talk to this one person, and they're able to tell you how things would work, and where you can meet them, and how to go about it. There wasn't much of a bureaucratic wall there. It was just people. So the group is really the collective. We keep saying the collective, but really they're made of people that sort of um, um, touch on each other's work, and sort of support each other as they embark on this very institutional, very crucial work for undocumented workers. So they were very forthcoming about information, because they knew that there were other people as well who have researched with them in the past. So I'm not the first to research with them. So they also have experience, and they also they encourage the researchers to live with them in this house. But because of the pandemic, I couldn't live with them at the time. So when restrictions opened up, I was able to finally get to them in London, but only for like 2 days. So yeah.
Okay, I guess that's it. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. If I missed a question in the chat, I'm really sorry. Uh, but of course, you can still ask Julie questions, right? the conversation does not end here. So thank you, Julie, for that wonderful presentation, of course, and for answering our, all our questions.